Hello everyone, I'm Mohammad Romesha Firdos from 2CSSC pairing roll number 21BQ1A05E7. Now I'm going to discuss about life cycle of a servlet. So the entire life cycle of a servlet is managed by the servlet container, which uses a Java x.servlet.servlet interface to understand the servlet objects and manage it. So before creating a servlet object, let's first understand the life cycle of the servlet object, which is usually understanding how the servlet container manages the servlet object. So the stages of the servlet life cycle are loading the servlet, initializing the servlet, requesting handling, and destroying the servlet. Let's look at each of these stages in detail. So number one, loading the servlet. The first stage of the servlet lifecycle involves loading and initializing the servlet by the servlet container. The web container or servlet container can load the servlet at either of the following two stages, which are initializing the context on configuring the servlet with a 0 or positive integer value. If the servlet is not preceding stage, it may delay the loading process until the web container determines that this servlet is needed to service a request. The servlet container performs two operations in this stage, loading and instantiation. Loading loads the servlet class, and instantiation creates an instance of the servlet. To create a new instance of the servlet, the container uses a no argument constructor. So let's move on to the next stage, which is initializing the servlet. After a servlet is instantiated successfully, the servlet container initializes the instantiated servlet object. The container initializes the servlet object by invoking the servlet.init of servlet config method, which accepts servlet config object reference as parameter. The servlet container invokes the servlet.init of servlet config method only once. Immediately after the servlet.init servlet of config object is instantiated successfully. This method is used to initialize the resources such as database, JDBC data source. Now, if the servlet fails to initialize, then it performs the servlet container by throwing the servlet exception or unavailable exception. So now next step is handling a request. After initializing, the servlet instance is ready to serve the client request. The servlet container performs the following operations when the servlet instance is located to service a request. It creates a servlet request and servlet response objects. In this case, if this is a HTTP request, then the web container creates HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response objects, which are subtypes of the servlet request and servlet response objects respectively. After creating this request and response objects, it invokes the servlet.service of servlet request and servlet response method by passing the request and response objects. The service method, while processing the request, may accept the servlet exception and unavailable exception or IO exception. Destroying a servlet. When a servlet container decides to destroy the servlet, it performs the following operations. It allows all the threads currently running in the service method of the servlet instance to complete their jobs and get released. After currently running threads have completed their jobs, the servlet container calls the destroy method on the servlet instance. After the destroy method is executed, the servlet container releases all the references of this servlet instance so that it becomes eligible for garbage collection. So the servlet lifecycle methods are init, service, and destroy. Thank you.